I am Padmaja Sarathy, and we're going to have a webinar session, thanks to AbleNet University, focusing on the Paraeducator Series. In a way, it's wonderful that we are starting the series because many of you may have heard, thanks to the Every Student Succeeds Act, the law that came into effect December 15, 2015, we are going to have a lot more empowerment. In a way, the paraeducators will have a seat and a voice at the table. And so we are starting this series at a very good time, because next time when I do the webinar, I will go into a little bit more detail about how some of the changes are going to impact positively the paraeducators and their professional development. And I do not like to start any meeting, any webinar with a little bit of a problem, but this morning we have had a little bit of a challenge with the internet connection. So I am depending on Deb from AbleNet to help me go through the slides. But I still very much look forward to presenting the webinar and sharing the information on this. Next slide. As I said, I've been working in this area of paraeducators for a number of years, and in 2012 I created a DVD with multiple trainer of training. It trains the trainer to deliver professional development to paraeducators, and there is also a trainee manual with multiple units, and it has quizzes, pre-assessment, post-assessment, and that's what has given me this opportunity to share this information with you all. And also I have been very fortunate to be presenting this session to other districts, as well as the opportunity to visit with on-site classrooms where I can observe and provide on-site coaching and guidance to paraeducators. And many of you who are joining me for my webinar session might have seen some of these books already, and I'm an author of multiple products. So what is the focus of this session today? What is our objective? This session will focus on the critical need that paraeducators have to deliver optimal and discrete support to students. How do we achieve a balance between providing personalized support to maximize the learning opportunities for students with special needs, while at the same time, how do we encourage the growth of independence? In other words, we always begin with the end in mind. And the end in mind is to promote that growth of independence in the student. Recently, in the last 10 years or so, a lot of research has emerged that kind of point out some of the concerns that the support from paraeducator can either be helpful or can be kind of a person who hovers over the student, which in case it becomes more of an issue. So a lot of research has emerged from that, and we'll be looking at and examining that research a little bit so that we are cautious about how a paraeducator should support the student. And we will kind of identify some of the student-centered, non-intrusive, optimal support. What are some steps? What are some things we need to be following up on? And one of the things I want to mention right at the outset, what happens is in the paraeducator's eagerness to support students with disabilities, sometimes the paraeducators become overzealous. In other words, they want to do everything for the student. They want the student to be successful. It comes out of good intentions, but sometimes it has unexpected, unintended consequences. So we have to be constantly asking, are we hovering over the student or are we helping the student? Because ultimately, as I said, we want the student to gain independence. The next slide, please. We are looking at what is happening to the paraeducator roles in the recent years. As a result of inclusion, which is a wonderful thing, but what has happened is paraeducators are very much involved in supporting students with special needs, with disabilities. And what research is showing, they deliver actually direct service to children and provide instructional support in a broad range of academic areas, and they don't always have the necessary training. And we have had situations where the paraeducator has, for example, asked me, I am sent into the general education classroom. I'm supposed to help the student with algebra, but I have never received training in this kind of mathematics to do that. So that's one of the concerns that's happening. And they're also working with some of the students who have the most kind of complex educational and behavioral needs, and they don't always have that kind of behavioral training or the instructional support techniques training. So that also causes kind of quite a bit of anxiety for the paraeducator, anxiety for the whole system, and for the para-teacher collaboration as well. Next slide, please. So you are looking at a chart that says delivering paraeducator support, concerns, and solutions. So on the left side, you are seeing some of the major concerns. What is happening is, as a result of the paraeducator going into the general education classroom, or even if they're providing support to students in a self-contained classroom, what research is showing that the student is receiving reduced attention from the teacher because frequently they are assigned, let's say, one-on-one paraeducator support, and so the teacher kind of feels there is the paraeducator providing that support, and so that kind of a backseat they take. And the other concern is the prompt dependence, and we will be looking at each one of them in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. And the other concern is it is negatively impacting the student with special needs interacting with peers, both regular peers and the peers maybe who is in his classroom, or peers with similar special needs. And one of the other major concerns, which is also a concern that I myself have based on my observations in many classrooms, how is it impacting the growth of the students' independence? As I said, that's our ultimate goal. That is why we have the paraeducator supporting the student, so that the student becomes as self-dependent as possible. We are also going to be looking at a number of solutions, but we may not be addressing all of those solutions in this particular webinar. You are looking at like paraeducator and teacher role clarity. We will be addressing that in the next webinar. But minimizing proximity and maximizing invisible and discrete paraeducator support to students, that is an area we are going to be examining in greater detail. And assisting the paraeducator to team up with the teachers for effective delivery of support, we'll be looking at the next webinar. And throughout these webinars, I'm going to emphasize the absolutely critical need for paraeducators to be trained, because they are asking for it. As a matter of fact, when I was in one of the school districts and I was training them for a couple of days, they said that's the first training they have had in more than 10 years. So paraeducators or crying out for help in terms of their training. The next slide, please. And this is a slide that has the title, Paraeducator Support, some of the unintended consequences that I mentioned about. A number of studies have examined the role of the paraeducator as well as how their support is helping or hurting students with special needs. Generally, paraeducator support, I would say, is helpful, but sometimes there are some unintended consequences. One of the studies pointed out that the classroom teachers tend to interact with the student much less when there is a paraeducator supporting the student. And so that's why we have to be kind of careful when we request one-on-one support, especially because then the teacher attention is even less. Or we have to have a system whereby that paraeducator support, even if it is initially one-on-one, it is gradually faded. The second important thing that emerged from research is the physical separation from classmates. What they found that frequently the paraeducator is sitting within 3 feet of the students. And also, maybe due to a variety of reasons, the student may be working on a totally different material and not what the classroom is working on. Also, another issue may be there are some behavior issues that the student is exhibiting, and so because of that, the student may be sitting at the periphery. And recently, I was in a classroom. As a matter of fact, this was a pre-K classroom. And in this pre-K classroom, this should not be happening, but unfortunately, this was. And the only reason I could find out these 2 students were students with special needs because they were kind of about 3 feet away from all the other children who were sitting on the rug. And there were 2 paraeducators, each one for one of the students, and they were sitting right behind the student. And the students themselves, I felt, were attending fairly well, but one of the students was constantly stretching his legs. That's all he was doing. He was paying attention. He was not running around the room. He was not acting up in any way. He was not shaking his head. He was not making any noises. But the only thing he was doing was stretching his leg, and continuously his sitting position was being corrected. And that was, to me, is maybe out of good intentions because they wanted the student to be just like everybody else, crossing their legs while sitting on the floor in the tailor fashion and attending, but these are some things. He could have been sitting pretty close so that, and then they themselves, the peers themselves, could serve as a model. So that is one of the concerns. So we are moving on to the next slide. And that one is a very interesting one. This one talks about the risk of being bullied. Strangely, while on the one hand, many students feel the paraeducator as the protector, and they can go to the paraeducator for help when they are being bullied, it also creates a kind of stigma for the student. Because when the paraeducator is absent, the students get bullied and teased much more. So this is one concern that needs to, everybody needs to be aware of. And the other thing, as I mentioned, it also promotes unnecessary dependence. Students with disabilities can be kind of hesitant in beginning and initiating a conversation. They may be hesitant in responding to a question. They may be waiting for a prompt or a cue from the paraeducator because they've become used to it. So these are all things that we need to be aware of, be alert so that the support is effective, but at the same time, it's not overly intrusive. Next slide, please. And this one talks about the stigmatization, because what's happening is when they have an adult who is kind of following them to various places, to the cafeteria, to the bus ramp, or to take them to other classes, the students with disabilities can easily feel embarrassed, or maybe have kind of a feeling of discomfort because there is somebody who is following me wherever I go. So it can affect them in negative ways. And as I mentioned previously, it also interferes with their interactions with peers, with communicating with their classmates or with other students in the school. So this is a very interesting study. As a matter of fact, this author, Costin Theo Harris, has a book, and it is listed in the resources section, which is a very interesting reading if you want to learn more about paraeducators. What they found, they did a study, and they found constant presence of the paraeducator next to the student can have some unintended effect, and it will impact negatively the peer interactions. During a 4-week period of observation, a student interacted with a peer let's say 32 times. That's what this one says. So there were 32 interactions, and 29 of them, the maximum number possible almost, 29 of them occurred on the days when the paraeducator was not present. In other words, when the paraeducator was present, there was not that many interactions between the students. So this is something that we need to be very cautious and alert about. Next slide, please. So there was another study, interesting study, that was done. And this study examined the perspective of students as they were graduating from high school. In other words, they were either in their senior year or they had just left the high school and graduated, and they conducted an interview. And a small number of these interviewees, respondents, recall their experience with the paraeducators with fondness, with good positive memories. But the majority of the students expressed kind of powerful messages. They kind of were somewhat embarrassed. They felt a little lonely. Some of these feelings, emotions, rejection, fear, stigmatization, all of these were expressed. But I do want to mention a word of caution here. This is one study, and we don't want to overgeneralize from this one study, but this is just a note of caution. And many paraeducators deliver services that are most helpful to students. But at the same time, we also have to look at the research data and say, what can we do to improve the situation? So when the students voiced their opinion, this is how they classified the role of the paraeducator. Some of them mentioned that she functioned like a mother. She was just like my mother, which in a way is wonderful because that's how much help and support and caring the paraeducator gave to the student. But at the same time, the paraeducator is not the mother, and we need to be certainly aware of it. And the other issue that came up was some of the students said she was my best friend. So in other words, yes, they could share with the paraeducator, they can take their concerns, and she was their helper, certainly, but a paraeducator is not their friend, and they have to find a friend among their peers. And the third thing that emerged from this research was that the paraeducator served kind of like a protector, somebody who cares for them, the protector from bullying. And again, we want to empower these students to protect themselves from bullies and not always depend on an external persons to protect them. And then the last thing, which I already kind of referred to earlier, the paraeducator served as their primary teacher. And certainly the teacher, general education teacher or the special education teacher, is the teacher for them. The paraeducator is the support person and the teaching assistant in supporting the student. I do want to mention one thing at this point. I am mentioning using the word paraprofessional here. That is how the research referenced them. The one thing that has changed with ESSA and the National Education Association and the Council for Exceptional Children, all three, the two organizations and the law, the term is paraeducator. And so I refer to the paraprofessionals as paraeducator because that is the preferred term. Now going back to the slide, students voicing their opinions, all of the above perception, in other words, looking at the paraprofessional as a mother or a friend or protector from bullies or as primary teacher, we have to now carefully consider, is this helpful or not? It's certainly not. It is certainly hovering, and it is certainly too intrusive, and we have to move a little bit away from this model to the helper and the support person. Next slide, please. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the paraeducator training is critical. It's very essential, and knowledge is power for all of us, and just as much for paraeducators. And frequently, paraeducators may not receive the specialized training that they need in order to be effective. And the good news is, when they are trained, it led to improved outcomes in not only the students' academic engagement, but also improve their interactions with their peers and inclusion with their typical peers, and ultimately led to students' independence and reduction in challenging behavior. So with all these positive benefits, so the focus has to be very much on training the paraprofessionals. So if you're training paraprofessional, what are some essential components that it should have? A variety of things, from kind of basics about the law and the disability information, as well as how do you address the behavioral skills? How do you address instructional materials? How do you provide academic and instructional support? How do you make sure, like this session, a little bit brief overview of how do you provide support that's discrete? And the teacher and the paraeducator role clarification. What can the teacher do? What can the paraeducator do? What are some things that the paraeducator should not be doing? What the paraeducator can be doing? So, and any training that is provided to paraeducator, it has to be blended with real application, with classroom vignettes and case studies and a number of role play activities and problem solving situations, both group and individual activities, as well as checklists, quizzes, and a kind of pre-assessment and a post-assessment. And I am delighted to share with you that my training DVD offers all of these features. Now we are moving on to the next slide, and the next slide is a classroom scenario with Caleb as the student and what happens in this situation. The student is a first grader. He's a first grader. He is included in the general education classroom, and he receives paraeducator support. He is verbal. He is eager to communicate, and he likes to have friends, but he does not always demonstrate problem-solving skills, and his cognitive skills are somewhat limited. We don't know why it is. It is possible he has some issues there, and he meets eligibility for intellectual disabilities. And as I said, the setting is the first grade classroom. And the teacher is presenting a science lesson, and the paraeducator is providing one-on-one support to the student. And she is sitting beside him. And when the teacher directs a question at the student, he turns to the paraeducator and she kind of whispers the answer and repeats the answer. So immediately concerns are raised. Is the paraeducator support just right? Is it true intrusive? Does the student need prompting? Has he become totally prompt dependent? Are there other ways that he could have been encouraged to respond? These are all things. It is possible at the initial stages, Caleb may be somewhat hesitant because he's, let's say at this point, prompt dependent. Are there ways maybe she could use an index card and say, try, go ahead. Or maybe give a gesture or a sign, you do it. And are there ways? And also there is something that maybe the teacher can also do. In other words, knowing that Caleb kind of lacks confidence in responding even when he sometimes knows the answer, is maybe ask somebody, a child who can answer the question correctly and repeat that same question, and then the paraeducator kind of encourages, yes, you know it, go ahead. And that, so that she does not have to whisper the answer. And unfortunately, while the scenario may seem like it doesn't happen, it does, unfortunately, does happen, at least based on my observation, that the paraeducator kind of provides much more of a prompt than necessary. So we have to be constantly be alert to the amount of prompt and the cues, and is there a way that milder, less intrusive prompt, cues, gestures, encouragement can be used to get a student to respond. The next slide, please. We have another student, a student who is a little bit more involved than Caleb, Melissa, and she meets eligibility for other health impairment, and she has the diagnosis of cerebral palsy. She is in a 4th grade classroom. She is in a general education classroom. She does not use words to communicate, and she does have a tendency to kind of make vocalizations which kind of sound a little noisy maybe, and she drops things, and it can be disruptive to the flow of instruction in the classroom. And so the paraeducator decides to move Melissa away from the other students and kind of decides to bring different kinds of materials than what the classroom is working on to work with her. So, and these materials are not at all related to what the class is working at that particular time. So the question that arises is, here it is a different type of issue. The issue is who is kind of making the decision on adaptations. Should this not be, if this is a problem that's occurring in terms of the behavior issues, in terms of Melissa making noises, in terms of Melissa kind of being somewhat disruptive to the flow of instruction, should that be addressed as part of a team? If she is not using words to communicate, is there assistive technology that's being used to support her responses? Are we using UDL principles? So this is not a decision that is made should be made by the paraeducator at the spur of the moment. This should be a team decision when the general education teacher, the special education teacher, and the paraeducator who is with the student on an ongoing basis, and she will have access to information that is most relevant and meaningful in discussing the situation. Should be discussed as a team, and they have to come up with situations, and they have to come up with a plan, and they have to come up with a program that provides and aligns with what is going on in the general education classroom using UDL principle to kind of maybe slightly modify the task and adapt the task so that it's at an easier complexity level for Melissa. So these are all some issues that we have to be cautious about in helping the paraeducator to play an effective role. Moving on to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier on, in many, many classrooms, paraeducators are sitting within 3 feet of the student they support. So this is a concern, but from the paraeducator's perspective, as a matter of fact, this is a concern that a paraeducator shared with me, which I have included in my training materials. If I'm not sitting next to the student and the student has a little bit of a problem, then I will be blamed kind of things. And then I will be viewed as though I am not helping the student. So this is an issue that paraeducators have brought. The paraeducator's job is not contingent upon the student's dependency on the paraeducator. And also, as I said previously, this has to be a team decision, and the paraeducator is not required to sit within 3 feet. And as a matter of fact, it's much more hurtful when that happens. Next slide, please. So we have another situation, and this is actually an aha moment for the paraeducator. And there she is making a kind of a mild spur of the moment decision, but it is not a major instruction adaptation. She knows that Robert has a little bit of a problem with paying attention, and he kind of gets anxious and restless. And when she sees that he's getting fidgety, she kind of gives a little task, and I'm sure she has mentioned this and discussed it with the teacher. So she kind of gives a little task to Robert. Robert, I want you to run a quick errand for me. And she gives a little note saying, you know, Robert is visiting you, and he goes to the office, gives that note, and he says hello, and just at walking to the office and back kind of gets that little bit of fidgetiness out of him, and Robert is much more ready to continue with his work. So this is a kind of a helpful support that the paraeducator can provide, and this is truly the kind of aha moments we want that are not too intrusive, where you are changing the curriculum that the student is working on. Next slide, please. Another aha moment in terms of the paraeducator support. For example, this is a student who has difficulty composing sentences and writing essays, and so the paraeducator has been observing that for a while. So she takes the situation to the teacher and to the special education teacher, and they all sit together and they work out a kind of a plan. So instead of assuming, oh, John doesn't want to do that, he has an attitude, and he doesn't like to write, they find a way to get John to do the writing. So she comes up with an idea. Actually, it's the paraeducator. She said, how about using a graphic organizer and then providing him a bank of words and maybe a couple of starter sentences? Then maybe he will get. And then you can gradually fade this additional assistance of the starter sentences. So these are some ways the paraeducator can provide support without being too intrusive. So the other concern that I mentioned previously is the dependence on prompts. The next slide, please. I am looking at the dependence that students have on someone, especially an adult, giving prompts to them. And particularly students with severe disabilities may become much more prompt dependent. And I would like to bring attention to one of the incidents that I had many, many years ago. I hope that doesn't happen anymore. And I was in a classroom as a consultant, and the paraeducator was feeding a high school student. And the student didn't seem to have any motor issues to help himself in terms of the food. And the reasoning that was, the rationale that was given for the paraeducator feeding the student was, he will make a mess and he will drop things all over the floor, and so it is much easier and much quicker to feed him. And that definitely promotes prompt dependence. Other than for somebody walking into the classroom, your perception changes when you see an adult feeding a high school student. Immediately your perception of that student as though you, instead of, it's kind of almost evokes pity for the student, which it should not be. We want dignity for the student. So all it required is really a plastic sheet under the table, so that even if the student messes it up, he can just pick it up, and shake it in the trash can. So that's one thing. The other thing the prompt dependence has a negative impact on, the student is not able to generalize it because he's always waiting for that prompt to occur. And one of the other issues is what happens is students, when they have always received a kind of either a physical prompt or a verbal prompt, to support them, they are not looking for natural cues that are available. If everybody is lining up, then I need to line up too. If everybody is putting their material inside the desk, I need to do that too, instead of having a paraeducator come to the student and say, you need to put your binder away. You need to line up. So in other words, they are not paying attention to cues. This is what the research is showing. Next slide, please. So as we try to bring this webinar to a close, I want to mention, please watch the prompts. Be alert to your body language, to your facial expressions, the way the questions are phrased, the tone of your voice, and instead of saying, do you think, and have a clear choice for the student to make. Do not indicate by your words that, oh, are you sure, type of thing, but instead have a clear choice for the student to make in terms of a correct response or an incorrect response. Ultimately, we want to promote that confidence in the student to be able to attempt to respond and not watching out for the paraeducator's prompt or the adult reaction to shape his response or her response. Next slide, please. Okay, this is something that I frequently find, especially in the early childhood classrooms and in kindergarten classrooms, is and sometimes even with older children, the way we present the information and the way we accept the student's response. This is a case about a student, 5-year-old, in a kindergarten, and the paraeducator is kind of reinforcing counting skills. She is trying to make sure that Jonathan has one-to-one correspondence. So she asks him to give me 4 bears, and he counts the bears, and as soon as he has given her 4 bears, she closes her hand. In other words, she kind of almost stops him from giving any more. And she immediately kind of praises him and says, good job. So in other words, you are not sure at that point whether it is a prompted response or whether Jonathan really has one-to-one correspondence concept clearly in his head. Has he acquired that concept? So in other words, through our actions, through our reactions, through our prompting and closing the fist to say, okay, you're done. But if she had her hand open and if he continued to give her bears, I wonder how would she note that as a prompted or a non-prompted? Or does she have to immediately go and correct him, make an error correction so that there is systematic instruction? So paraeducators do need instruction on systematic instruction and errorless prompting. And fortunately, in this particular case, the teacher was watching, actually kind of guided. And so that is also an important responsibility of the teacher. Next slide, please. So we have to make sure that these prompts are student-specific, individualized and personalized for the student. And if you do provide at the initial stage verbal prompts, gradually those prompts have to be faded so that it is gesturing or pointing rather than a complete total verbal prompt. The other prompt that can be used is kind of visual cues for some students that may be more helpful, especially students with autism. If you provide a kind of a visual support in terms of a visual cue, that is helpful. And ultimately, we want all students to experience success in their ability to come up with the answer and to make the right decision and be as independent as possible. The next slide, please. So some of the questions that you want to consider. What can the student do without assistance? For example, in that example of feeding himself, can the student pick up the spoon or pick up the fork and feed himself? Can the student learn the set of 5 bears or a set of 4 bears and what that quantity represents? What are some areas you can identify to promote social acceptance and peer support? And I'm going to share with you in a minute a kind of an aha moment for a paraeducators. So you have to look at what are some areas you will target for independence. So the next slide, please. So how do you promote students' communication? Certainly you want to limit the amount of adult talk and encourage and draw out the student to talk. Provide sufficient time, wait time for the student to respond, for the student to initiate communication, for the student to make comments. And you have to create a situation where the student-to-student interaction happens and it continues so that they can build friendships, and it also improves the student's ability to communicate. So it's a good idea to follow this Goldilocks rule. Not to be chummy, not too chummy, not too formal. The paraeducator is not the buddy. So in other words, remember all those 4 things we said at the beginning. Not the mother, not the friend, not the protector, and not the teacher. So that's kind of the Goldilocks rule that the paraeducators, and as a matter of fact, all teachers and all support personnel should follow. So this is one aha moment I'd like to share. And this was in the middle school paraeducator and Brian, and how she encouraged Brian to communicate with his peers. Miss Murphy was so competent at the same time. She wanted to so desperately encourage Brian's inclusion with all other students. So she would always ask him to sit with the others when they went to lunch to the cafeteria. And on this occasion, and she often found some ways to encourage Brian's kind of initiating a talk with his peers. So on this occasion, Brian had shared with her that he had gone to a ball game. So she says, "Hey Brian, did you tell Alan about your experience at the ball game last night? I'm sure they would like to hear. And I have got an errand to run, so I'll be back. Go ahead and share your experience with your friends." And so kind of these are ways we can encourage our students to communicate and initiate interaction. And this is the kind of aha moments we want to see more and more of to enable our students to be competent in initiating communication, establishing friendships, and having positive social interaction. So create your magical moments, whether you are the paraeducator or the teacher, in encouraging students. And particularly we need to guide paraeducators who are providing a lot of support to our students to do this. Next slide, please. So these are some action steps. You want to move away when the student is engaged in a conversation or asking a peer for help. The paraeducator needs to kind of step out. One of the most important things is not to have a chair or a seat next to the student. That makes the student dependent, and also it kind of creates a perception the student cannot function without the paraeducator's support. And the other thing is we want to make sure that the paraeducator is not carrying the materials for the student unless the student needs such kind of motor help. We want the student as much as possible to carry. If the student is using a wheelchair, the materials can be put in a backpack on the back of the chair. And let the student hand in this work, even if it is not perfect, instead of the student depending on the para to hand in the work or make the correction. And whenever you are providing a physical prompting to a student, it is important for the paraeducator. First of all, it's a good idea to fade that physical prompting, but if the physical prompting is necessary at the initial stage of learning, it is important to ask the permission of the student. I'm going to put my hand over your hand to help you. And this is appropriate at the early stages, but gradually this needs to be faded. Next slide, please. So remember the 5 mantras. I know we are going over the time a little bit, and maybe we were a couple of minutes late. And because of the fact that I had some internet connection issues, I apologize. But these, as we close, I would like you to remember these 5 mantras for paraeducator support, and I think it'll help everyone who are supporting students with special needs. Get to know and connect with the learner. That does not mean providing intrusive support, but much more how can you provide discrete support. Engineer and make sure a favorable learning environment is present for the student. If you're a paraeducator, build up your instructional skill levels and the knowledge levels, and help to implement the adaptations that have been already approved as part of the student's plan. And as much as possible, have that goal in mind to foster learners' independence. Next slide, please. So it is a kind of a delicate dance, and it has to be choreographed very carefully. And it has to be kind of a teamwork. And ultimately, we want to make sure that support is a planned support, optimal support, and discrete support, and it is not intrusive. And as much as possible, we need to use the peers as supports, who are the natural supports available in the classroom. Next slide, please. These are all some of the resources that you can use. And I have included the paraeducator Trainer's Guide, the DVD, as one of the resources available, and there is a Paraeducator Trainee Manual that comes with it also, and some of the other products too. And we have a couple of Paraeducator webinars that are coming up. The next one on July 12th will focus on the teacher and the paraeducator teaming for student success. And then the paraeducator providing behavior supports will come in September, and that webinar will be on September 29th. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. And